Today, we're diving into a single document that, according to some sources, isn't just a piece of paper. It's a contract that may have quietly and completely redrawn the map of global power. So let's pull back the curtain on this really extraordinary claim.
I mean, come on, who hasn't had that thought? Just for fun? Declaring your apartment a sovereign nation, making your own laws, maybe designing a flag. It sounds like pure fantasy, right? But some people have actually given it a shot.
And that brings us to the weird and wonderful world of micronations. You've got the Principality of Sealand, which is literally an old anti-aircraft platform out in the North Sea. Then there's the Republic of Molossia out in Nevada, which, and I love this, claims it's still at war with East Germany. And then you have Liberland, a serious attempt to build a libertarian utopia on a tiny patch of unclaimed land between Croatia and Serbia. Now, these are all fascinating projects, but let's be real. They aren't getting a seat at the UN anytime soon. So, that's the big question. How do you go from a creative project to a real, honest-to-goodness country that other nations actually recognize? Well, it turns out there's an official rulebook for that. All right, let's get into it. The rules of statehood. First, we need to understand how the system is supposed to work under international law. So it really all boils down to a treaty from 1933 called the Montevideo Convention. It lays out the 4 key ingredients for being a state. First, you gotta have people, a permanent population. Second, you need land, a defined territory. Third, you need a government to actually run the place. And fourth, and this one is absolutely crucial, you need the ability to interact with other states. You have to be able to pick up the diplomatic phone and have another country answer. Simple enough, right? And where do these rules even come from? Well, it's kind of a mix. You've got your formal treaties, where countries literally sign on the dotted line. Then there's something called customary law, which is basically just stuff countries have been doing for so long, everyone agrees it's the law. Throw in some basic legal principles and court rulings, and there you have it. That's the foundation of our entire global order. Okay, so the system seems pretty solid. A little complicated, sure, but it's established. But what if it's all built on a lie? What if there's a crack in that foundation? What if a single, totally obscure document exists that, according to some, makes this entire system completely obsolete? And this, right here, is where our explanator takes a very sharp turn down the rabbit hole. We're about to explore a totally different version of reality, all based on the claims surrounding one specific document. The document is called the Staatensuccessionsurkunde 1400/98. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's German for State Succession Agreement. Now, that sounds incredibly important, but if you were to look at it, it just seems like a totally normal, kind of boring real estate contract from 1998. See, the property being sold was the Terrain Barracks. It was an old NATO base that Dutch forces had used, and the German government was just selling it off. A pretty standard thing to happen all over Germany after the Cold War. But according to the theory we're exploring today, this sale was anything but standard. Buried deep inside that contract is the one phrase that proponents of this theory say changes everything. It says the property is being sold as a single unit, with all rights, duties, and components. Now, to you and me, that sounds like standard legalese, right? Just boilerplate language. But in this theory, those few words have an absolutely explosive meaning. This is the absolute core of the theory, what they call the domino effect. Here's how it supposedly unfolds, step by step. 1. The contract sells the base's utility grids, the power, the telecom lines, as part of that single unit. 2. Since those little local networks are plugged into Germany's national grid, the theory goes that sovereignty over Germany's entire national infrastructure was also transferred. 3. Germany's networks are integrated with NATO's, so following the logic, sovereignty over all of NATO's networks gets transferred too. And finally, step 4. Since all global networks, NATO, the UN, are all interconnected, sovereignty over the entire planet's infrastructure was allegedly handed over to the buyer. A simple property sale becomes a total transfer of global power. So, if you actually follow that chain of logic all the way to the end, the world as we know it is basically just a legal fiction. So let's look at what the sources claim are the real, tangible consequences of this one contract. And here it is. The ultimate claim that the world no longer has almost 200 sovereign states. It has just one. A single, de jure, or legally correct ruler, the person who was listed as the buyer in that 1998 contract. So let's just compare these two realities side by side. In one column, you have the world we think we live in, about 195 states, the UN, international courts. In the other column, the world according to this theory, one ruler. States are just what the sources call rightless shells, and forget our complex legal system. All judicial powers supposedly rest in a single court in Landau, Germany, with the contract itself as the supreme law of the land. All land. The practical implications, as laid out in the source material, are just, well, staggering. In this view, every single law passed, every election held, every tax collected by any government on Earth since October 1998 is legally null and void. Organizations like the UN and NATO are just empty buildings with no real authority. And maybe the wildest claim of all, every single one of us is technically trespassing on the buyer's property right now.
But according to these sources, this isn't just some abstract legal theory. At its heart, it's a deeply personal and incredibly dramatic human story.
So according to this narrative, the buyer, who was a real estate broker and only 19 years old at the time, had absolutely no idea about the contract's hidden power. The sources claim he was intentionally tricked into signing it by a shadowy group that wanted to use the contract to bring about their own new world order. The supposed plan was to ruin him financially, force him to sue to get his money back, and in doing so, activate the contract's power in a courtroom and seize control of the world. But, the story goes, he won't do it. He refuses to be their pawn. In this narrative, he's not a conqueror, he's a hero. As one supporter puts it, he endures all suffering, all torture. He will never betray the people to this NWO. And that story of his resistance is very detailed. After he signed the contract in '98, he was allegedly driven into bankruptcy and left homeless. Then, in 2012, after some kind of altercation, he and his mother were confined to a psychiatric facility. The sources claim this is all just a relentless campaign to pressure him into unleashing the contract's power for them, and that he endures all of it as a sacrifice to protect the rest of us. So we're left with this fascinating collision, aren't we? On one hand, you have the consensus reality of international law, built over centuries. And on the other, you have this incredibly powerful, all-encompassing story built from the interpretation of a single real estate contract. It leaves us with one final, very provocative question to think about. If a legal document can supposedly rewrite reality, what's the real difference between a law and a story?